For the last few months, I've been playing an instructive beginner speedrun on chess.com, where I play against beginner players in rapid games. Everybody I play gets their points refunded, but it's a nice way to look at the kinds of mistakes being made at the lower levels and see how to best move beyond those. And in the process, I've encountered some of the same mistakes being made over and over again, so I thought I would give a few examples of these to help you really level up your chess. The first mistake I've seen a lot of players making is pushing pawns at the expense of improving or even developing their pieces. So what does this look like in an actual game? Well, in this position, my opponent played the move f5, and honestly, I was kind of expecting that based on their previous few moves of just pushing pawns on the king side. So what is the problem with making this kind of a move in the opening? Well, we already have 3 pieces developed. Black only has 2 of their pieces developed, and when you're playing with the black pieces, you're already a step behind. So usually, especially with black, you want to be getting all of your pieces into the game and getting your king castled as soon as possible, because just based on how the game goes, you already are a tempo down right out of the opening. So pushing pawns like this at the expense of getting your pieces out is usually not a good idea, and we can very quickly see how this comes to be. So the idea is actually pretty clear. I can see exactly what black wants to do. They want to be kicking my pieces around over here and force them to go to less optimal squares, possibly even trap my bishop because I haven't pushed the h-pawn and the bishop has nowhere to go if their h-pawn were able to get all the way down to h4. But that's still a few moves away. So in the meantime, I have time to take advantage of a diagonal that has been opened up from my opponent pushing these pawns, which is this light squared diagonal right here. And this is a very important diagonal because, as you can see, it's aiming directly at black's king. So if I can get a piece onto that diagonal that is also going to be able to give check to the king, black has no pieces that are able to defend that against that check, and so the king will have to move, the king won't be able to castle, and it will be stuck in the center right out of the opening, which is a really bad thing if we're able to get more pieces into the party and start attacking it very quickly. So the way this went in the game, I jumped my knight onto e5. This was slightly inaccurate. It's moving a piece twice, which is another mistake we'll talk about. But in this case, I just wanted to open up this diagonal for my own queen to come in and give the check, possibly even give a checkmate if black doesn't do something about this knight. If we had a few more moves in a row, I would give this check right away. Black can do nothing else except move the king, and then I would come up here for the checkmate right on f7, protected by the knight. So already this early in the game, black is dealing with a potentially deadly threat. So black was essentially forced to take the knight on e5. I recaptured with my bishop, now aiming over here at the rook, forcing the rook to move, and usually, again, this early in the game, you want to develop your minor pieces. You don't really want to get your rooks into the game because they can very easily be kicked around. But in this case, of course, the rook is pretty much forced to move unless it wants to be lost. Black also could have just, in this position, developed their knight in order to block the bishop's attack on the rook and still retain some potential castling rights this way. Also notice that the queen side is very undeveloped, and so it's going to take black quite a while if they wanted to castle that way anyway. But after black moved the rook, this gave me the opportunity I needed to come in with the queen. Since they didn't block with the knight, this square is now open for my queen to come in and give the check, and the king had to move, and this made it very easy for me to continue the attack. Another thing a lot of beginners are often told is not to bring your queen out too early, and this is a good general rule. In this case, when I brought my queen out to h5, I was always calculating, as long as my queen stayed here for the next few moves, whether or not black was going to be able to try and trap my queen. That's really the issue with bringing your queen out too early, is that a lot of times you just kind of forget about it, and then black's pieces or your opponent's pieces are able to overwhelm you. You can see even now, as black continues to be pushing pawns, they are already making a counting mistake by giving up this pawn in the center. And again, this is at the cost of developing one of their pieces. So this pawn push, pushing the d-pawn forward, was possibly a good move to reroute the bishop and try and go after my queen. That might have been a better idea, but because black was so set on just pushing their pawns and kicking my pieces back, they ended up going down a pawn, their king was stuck in the center, and again, it was just really easy for me to continue the attack here. Just one move later, we can see how this actually plays out. I'm able to sneak my queen behind this enemy line of pawns. Once you get your pawns too far forward, a lot of times your opponent's pieces are able to sneak behind that fence that you've created, and you no longer have those pawns as protecting pieces against your king, against your other pieces. You can see already, this is a fork on the rook and on the bishop, and black is just busted here. And now we have another sort of opening mistake. A lot of these games, I realized looking back, were won quite early in the game, often even before like move 15, move 20. A lot of these mistakes are happening very early, and so if you can fix those early mistakes and get longer games, that will be great overall for your chess, because you'll be able to learn about different middle game plans and different end game things, rather than just being crushed right out of the opening because of the mistakes that you're making. So this next mistake that I've seen a lot is moving the same piece twice in the opening, or just attacking in general too early when you don't have all of your pieces developed. I also saw this a lot with the queen coming out, going for like a scholar's mate, but if your opponent knows how to defend against the scholar's mate, eventually you're going to realize that that's just not a great opening to play, because you have to move your queen all over the place pretty early in the game. Again, at the cost of developing your pieces. I keep emphasizing that because it really is important. If your opponent has a bunch of pieces in the game and all of yours are sitting on the back rank, who do you think is going to have the stronger attack? So in this position, my opponent moved the same piece twice, moved this bishop onto the e4 square, going after this knight, and if the knight moves, also looking at this pawn. And even if there weren't a tactic here that I'm going to show you, this is a positional mistake, a misunderstanding of what exactly you want to be doing with your minor pieces. Early in the game like this, you usually don't want to be trading your bishop for a knight. If at all possible, you'd like to keep both of your bishops. That's called having the bishop pair, and especially when positions open up, the bishop pair becomes really strong together because they can control all of the squares on the board because there's one of each color. So if my opponent made this bishop move with the intention of trading it off for my knight, again, this is just a misunderstanding of the way minor pieces work early in the game. They've made 3 bishop moves just to trade off their very strong light squared bishop for my knight on f3 it's just kind of chilling there. It's not really doing anything. On the other hand, keeping their bishop on the board, it's controlling this really strong diagonal, kind of infiltrating indirectly into my position. It's also on the same color diagonal that the queen and the king are on, and so this is just a good thing to be coordinating your pieces as well. So again, just a complete misunderstanding if this was the case, but in the meantime, we have a strong tactic that this move made possible. We can actually jump the knight into the center, and that's exactly what happened in the game. This is a really strong move. See, we are moving our piece more than once in the opening, but in this case, it's an actual threat. It's attacking the knight. More importantly, it's attacking the queen, and it's attacking this weak f7 square, in which case, if it's not defended, we would jump there and fork both of black's rooks. So this is an extremely strong move. This would be an example of an exception to the rule. You don't want to move pieces twice in the opening. Even though we are technically giving up this pawn, this threat against the queen and against the f7 square is just too strong for black to ignore. So the game continued with my opponent moving their queen, defending this f7 square. I decided to capture the knight on c6, and after black captured back, I'm forced to take with the pawn, of course, because if the queen takes, well, we also have a bishop looking at that square. But I was able to give this check on a6, and after the king, moved this way, this is the wrong way to go. To stay in the game, they actually should have gone towards the center, but in this case, I was able to bring my queen in for check. The king only has one legal move, and now we have this nice in-your-face checkmate on the b7 square. So you can see there are exceptions to every rule. In this same game, I moved a piece twice, my opponent moved a piece twice. One of them was good, one of them was not so good. And you can really see the nuances if you understand just basic positional concepts about the opening stages of the game. All right, this next mistake is looking at one move threats. And this is actually pretty similar to the last rule. A lot of times this happens right out of the opening. You are making a threat against one of your opponent's pieces that can easily be defended, and then your piece will just be on a suboptimal square for a very important portion of the game. So in this position, my opponent jumped their knight onto the d5 square, attacking my bishop, which is undefended, but because they went towards the center, I'm able to just rock my bishop back onto g3. It's perfectly fine here, it's totally defended, still aimed at the center, and now my opponent's knight is just on a bad square. I can very easily kick it around, and that's exactly what happened in the game after my opponent did another one of these sort of meaningless side pawn pushes. It's funny, you see these a lot at the Grandmaster level, pushing the A or the H pawns, and for a while I wasn't really sure why strong players were doing this, because at the beginner intermediate levels you're really told not to do this. It's a waste of time. You should be developing your pieces. But what I realized is that in these stronger Grandmaster games, the difference is that these side pawn pushes actually do something, which sounds kind of harsh, but in this situation, this pawn is not preventing any of my pieces from jumping in. It's not supporting one of their pieces from jumping in. There's a pawn here that is just preventing Black's knight from ever getting closer. And usually in Grandmaster games, it is more of a preventative move, or it is a base move that they're going to support an outpost piece, something like that, or preventing a pawn storm. Lots of different more positional ideas, but again, in this case, especially at the beginner level, you really should be just developing your pieces rather than pushing pawns just for no reason. But anyway, I continued by bringing my bishop out to the c4 square, developing with tempo, meaning that I'm developing a piece and forcing my opponent to do something that is not developing a piece, or that they would rather not do. So in this case, I'm attacking this knight and they have to do something to defend it. My opponent defended with a pawn, and I decided to capture and double Black's pawns on the d file. And usually doubled pawns like this are not so good because they're very easily attacked, because when they're not next to each other, they can't defend each other. So you have to waste time using your own pieces rather than pawns to defend those pawns. And that is the reason I decided this early in the game to trade off my bishop for my opponent's knight. In the previous example, we talked about why that's usually a bad idea, but if you're able to get some sort of positional advantage or win material, that's a case where you don't really mind giving up the bishop pair. In this case, I was very happy to double my opponent's pawns. In the case that instead my opponent had defended this knight by maybe moving the knight onto f3, so that if I were to capture, they could recapture with the knight, I may have reconsidered trading off my nice bishop for my opponent's misplaced knight, but in the case of the actual game, this just wasn't really even a question. Alright, the next theme that I saw a lot in these speedrun games is king safety. My opponents tended to not get their king castled soon enough, and this goes along with the previous things we've talked about. Developing your pieces, moving your queen out too early, all of these things play into king safety because it means that you're not actually taking the moves that you have, the limited amount of moves that you have in the beginning of the game, to get your king to safety, and you're allowing your opponent to very quickly build up an attack against your pieces. So this one's going to require a little bit of calculation, but in this position, after my opponent did a pretty nice job of developing their knight, they are getting their pieces out, but again, their queen is trapped in the center right in front of their king, so we're going to use that to find a pretty nice tactic. In this position, I played the move e5, and you may calculate and think that I have counted wrong, because after the pawn captures, I captured with the knight, my opponent captured with the knight, I captured with the bishop, and my opponent captured with the queen. And it looks like I've just given up a piece for just a pawn. We are already up a pawn, but it looks like I've just given up a piece. But you have to calculate one move further, and this is where the king safety comes in. After the queen captures, we are able to move the rook into the e-file, and there's nothing that the queen can do to escape. It's going to be lost because it is pinned to our opponent's king. And this might be hard to see when you're looking at this position, that, oh, this move is even possible after we have this massive trade on the e5 square. But if you're able to spot that your opponent's king and queen are lined up, or just that your opponent's king is stuck in the center, you don't even really have to take time considering whether you need to support this pawn push with the rook move in first. You can see this trick from a mile away. And again, this is a theme that I saw in so many games. I swear, like every single game, my opponent just refused to castle their king. I don't know what it is. So if you can improve that, I promise that your level of play will drastically increase, just because you will be able to spend more time in the phase of the game where you'll actually have a fighting chance. So the last mistake I want to talk about is trading pieces incorrectly. I think there's a tendency, and even I'm guilty of this sometimes, the tendency is to trade pieces just for the sake of trading pieces. You have this thing in your mind that's like, Well, the fewer pieces that are on the board, the fewer things I have to calculate, the simpler the position is. I'll just trade off all my pieces, we'll get to an endgame, and I'll win the endgame. That could not be further from the truth. If you've studied endgames at all, you probably know this. But especially if you're trading pieces in a way that is making your position worse, that is not a good idea, because once all the pieces come off the board, then you'll just have a worse position or a worse pawn structure. And let me show you what this actually looks like. So here in this position, we have queens off the board. It's a queenless middle game. There's a lot of development that still needs to happen. It's a pretty symmetrical position, but here my opponent played the move bishop to e6. And this is a mistake because after we capture the bishop, which is the obvious move, you should look for checks, captures, and threats. And this is very clearly a capture. Our opponent has to capture back with a pawn. And just like in that earlier example we saw, these doubled pawns are not very nice to deal with. They'll pretty easily get attacked. And long term, imagine all these pieces are gone. This is most likely going to be a winning endgame for white if all the pieces are off the board and there's just pawns left. Because again, these pawns just don't defend each other. So if the king is able to get in, able to eat up these pawns quickly, and then we can get a passer going. Having doubled pawns in the endgame is basically the equivalent of having just one pawn rather than two. And a little bit further in the game, we have this same position come up again that I'd like to show you. Here, I bring my bishop out. In this case, I'm willing to trade down to an endgame. This trade is not for no reason. In this case, I will not be doubling my pawns if the black bishop decides to capture. I will capture with the rook and get my rook a little bit further into the game. And I would like an endgame because theoretically that would be winning for me because of these doubled pawns. But my opponent, wanting to trade on their own terms, brought the knight back to defend this bishop so that if I were to capture, they could recapture with the knight and just get it a little bit closer to my position. That's not necessarily something I wanted to allow them to do, so I decided to bring my rook in again. We see this theme of king safety. The king is not castled, it's stuck in the center. And now we have this knight that is pinned to the king and cannot move. So now this knight is no longer actually defending the bishop. My opponent pushed b6 just to hang on to that bishop. Probably instead here it would have been best to just trade and get rid of this threat and then try and, I don't know, bring a rook over to defend this so they can get their king out of the center. It's still not a fantastic position for black, but it's very close to equal. But after b6, now I'm very happy to capture this bishop. The only way to recapture, because that knight is pinned, is with that b pawn, now the c pawn, and black now has two pairs of doubled pawns. We're very happy to see this. This is going to be a very nice endgame, and still the king is stuck in the center. So you can very quickly see how I was able to bring my pieces to the party, start winning pawns, start going after these pawns that don't have their buddies defending them. It's just a lot easier for these threats to be made because the pawns are not defending each other. That's just the black and white of it. So again, just trading pieces for no reason other than the fact that you think it will be simpler with fewer pieces on the board. That's not a great reason to do it. There should be a good reason when you decide to offer a trade or to accept your opponent's offer of a trade of minor pieces. I hope you can start noticing mistakes like this in your own chess, and hopefully that will help you really level up your own play. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.